God is a woman, and the Abrahamic scriptures are her false accusation against Satan. It's her demonizing the world. It's her flipping everything on its head and then projecting that onto Satan and saying that Satan just flips everything and is a reversal of everything that's good. The reason they make this accusation is because that's what they themselves are guilty of. So it is a question of who's reversing it, who's telling the truth. And this binary, this splitting of good and evil as black and white, it comes from religion. And libertarianism and the distinction between ethics and morality creates a gray space in the middle. And that's what liberty is. Liberty is the gray space in between good and evil. And I realized this when I was listening to a sermon from Bilal something. I mean, he's a pastor. I just found one on YouTube. I thought I'd listen to it. He described capitalism by saying that under capitalism, if you want to, leave all of your inheritance to your dog, then that's morally permissible. Like that's, he said, was morally correct even, not even just permissible. He said correct, and that really struck me as like obviously kind of a straw man. But from his perspective, it makes sense because a religious person, they squish that ground for liberty, right? The gray area of liberty gets squished into a binary of simply good and simply evil. And homosexuality is a great example of this. Really, it exists in a moral gray area. A lot of people who are very progressive and SJW, because statism is their religion, essentially, they have a vested interest in promoting it as the good, right? And then Christians, of course, can look at that and use that as their ammunition for saying, look, it's evil. It's pulling people towards Satan and away from their duty. Now, we all know this concept of original sin, this idea that you're born sinful and you have to do something to atone for it. And I know Christians, some of them will take issue with me saying you have to do something because they say, no, you don't have to do anything. You just have to have faith. Okay, fine. But you use that to just backdoor a bunch of requirements anyway. And having faith is still an action. It still has requirements of you, things like baptism and shit like that. It's not just having a belief. It's not just having faith. You can't just have faith on accident. You have to do something, okay? Do something or have faith, and definitely not do anything, right? The big fat asterisk on it, the size of the Bible. So they collapse morality into that strict binary because of original sin. That's the only way that you can argue that something in the moral gray area is bad, right? Because you should be doing something else. Now, libertarianism can mimic this in some way, but only after you've taken on some sort of responsibility. The best example is becoming a parent. Once you become a parent, your liberty shrinks because so much of what you do is going to be directly tied to the existence of someone else, which means that you lose a lot of this space to have a justification for, revelry. But then with homosexuality, it's in this gray area where that's properly where it should be. It's morally neutral. But from a Christian perspective, there's original sin, but also gender roles are a form of original sin, right? You have extra original sin adages added onto you if you're male, and extra ones added onto you if you're female. So basically original sin, it's the method by which you move the libertarian really, but all the liberty in the gray area into the black and into the white. And this is an interesting aspect of Christianity, which is that things that are morally bad, in that dark area, everybody agrees. It's only things in a morally gray area that Christians claim are evil. All of that invokes original sin. And more Christians are beginning to become conscious of that because at a fundamental level, they're libertarian. And this is what a religious moderate is they essentially want Christianity to be libertarian, and that's why they're okay with gayness, right? And it subverts the concept of original sin. It actually subverts a lot of it. And frankly, if you are a Christian, gayness and Christianity don't mix. They don't. at least not practicing homosexuality, and conversion therapy definitely does have its place within Christian morality, without question. That's just like a basic reality. It's kind of like you have to believe that like all of this anti-gay stuff in the Bible just like accidentally ended up there, and then there was just never any real clarification for it. Like, no, that's fucking retarded. It's obviously anti-gay. There's no getting around that. But the point is, as people become religiously moderate, it's basically just a weakening of the flavor of their religion. And that's all religion is. It's just a flavor that's weaker or stronger. And as it becomes weaker, they create more gray area space for liberty. Now, what I'm saying is once you get rid of all of religion entirely, you have a lot more gray space. But what ends up happening is people, because they were so used to relying upon religion to define the white and the black space, the good and the evil, they then have really, really bad and really non-objective and stupid-ass ways of trying to define the good and the evil, even though we all know what it is. We all really fundamentally do know, at least the evil. The good is a little bit more difficult to define, and it's much, much more highly subjective, I would argue. But the evil is not. The evil is very, very objective and very easy to explain, because your grounds for rejecting religion typically invoke logic, and the use of sciences and of math, everything is built on logic, and we always constantly appeal to logic, and we make logical assumptions when we exist, when we speak. If a person says something and then you attribute what they've said to that person, everything that's required in that amounts to a justification for libertarian ethics, essentially. It's that easy. But because so few people can articulate this little jump, people essentially just say, oh, well, I guess it must just all be a subjective free-for-all. And what a lot of just total idiots who are theists will argue is that they'll say, without religion, I would have no idea what's good or evil, right? So their argument is, I need to read this book to understand that it's wrong to murder people. But they don't, and they know that's true, but they're being disingenuous about it. And the reason they're being disingenuous is because at the basic level they are libertarians. And my main argument again is that your political views are more fundamental, and then your religious views get stacked on top of it. And this is why, with very little exception, your religious views bend and reshape themselves to fit your political narrative. And the political narrative is what more essentially defines a person and how they interact with others. And it's much, much harder to change, and I argue much, much more important. But for a lot of people, you have to dispel the stuff on top, the religious mumbo jumbo, in order to get at the heart of things and be able to discuss politics. But yeah, so if somebody wants to be very left-wing and socialist, they're going to find a way to justify it within their religious framework. And the same applies to small government people. Now, Islam is kind of an interesting exception because Islam is more explicitly political. It takes the religion and it explicitly inserts it to a large degree into statism. And this is why you see more consistent mapping, or more consistent, I guess, influence from the religion back down to the statism. But for other religions, because they're not necessarily explicitly tied to the government, this is why they'll bend to a government view. What religions do is they paint the world as Satan. They paint the world as darkness. They paint the world, they set up a juxtaposition where the otherworldly, beyond this world, is where the ultimate good is. And this world is full of temptations. And that's because what they're doing is they're taking things within that gray liberty area, and they have to find ways to demonize it. They have to find ways to paint it out as a temptation, right? As something that's bad or wrong somehow. And in doing so, they create a threat narrative. This is the same thing that statism does. Statism says you can't be free. Capitalism is evil. The market is evil. Humans are greedy. Humans are this way. They take things in reality and they just preemptively paint them as dark and as evil in order to basically trick you into thinking that things in the gray area are actually bad, and thus justifying their aggressive actions against those. It's all the same pattern, it's all the same shit. And basically, once you go all the way down to it, you're going to find that we're all libertarians even though we can't explicate it. And the reason I know this is because very few people are actually legitimate holders of their faith. They legitimately don't believe what they say they believe because of the reverse Pascal's wager. It proves that they don't actually believe in their own religions. And the fact that, if anything, your beliefs about the supremacy of God and everything, that should be the number one thing, right? And then that should be what influences your political view. But it's always the opposite. It's always the opposite. And if you look at a lot of what's written into Islam, it really does read like, oh, these people realized that they could write this into the religion in order to gain their advantages. So even if what's perceived as a bunch of people who, act violently or are terrorists or conquer things because their religion mandates it, the reason that it was written that way in the first place was to justify a political aim. So fundamentally, it's just a feedback loop of those two things. So statism is a religion, and it's the dominant religion. The reason that it's the more dominant religion that doesn't get influenced is because it hides. It is not out in the open identified as a religion. Thus, what I call the cosmetic religions, the fake religions, those function as a sort of shield against the true religion, which is statism. So statism is the one world global religion that needs to be dispelled completely. And this is why, I was listening to the Red Pill Religion podcast, and they were, they always complain about atheists and how, what they do is they always conflate it with communism. Is they say, look at this government that was explicitly anti-religion, they went communist, and this is what atheists are all about. And look how atheists are disproportionately liberal. Well, my counter-argument to that is very simple. Just as a lot of Christians self-identify as Christian even though they're not, most atheists who identify as atheists really are not atheists. They may be atheists in the sense that they don't believe in God, but they're still very deeply religious. They're religious because their religion is statism. And because explicating libertarianism in terms of objective morality, that's been swept under the rug and it's been, not really given any serious consideration, because just as people use religion in order to set up maxims that would push their political agenda, the same thing occurred with statism. It functioned the exact same way as all the religions did, but it had the added advantage of not coming out of the shadows. It stays in the shadows, uses the other religions as a basic shield and divides people that way, and then it gets to pretend that it's objective and non-religious. And that's the one thing that the other religions, if they really wanted to control everyone, they would have just depicted their religions as pure logic, right? Or something like that. They would have found a way to do it that way. And this is basically what statism achieved. Thus, statism is the ultimate religion and the ultimate thing that takes things in the moral gray area and casts it as evil in order to justify force and fraud. So there you go. That's basically a new explication of my idea that the left is evil, and as we move to the right, we begin to shed ideology and we shed falsehood and we create less space and less opportunity for evil to prevail.